heavily intoxicated man laid his hand on a royal guard's shoulder and refused to let go, even after being clearly warned. Instead of backing off, he tightened his grip. The guard gave him one final opportunity to walk away. He didn't take it, and what followed left the entire crowd stunned. Before we go any further, drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. And make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow, at the same time, we'll bring you another powerful story of the Royal Guard's unwavering strength and discipline. You won't want to miss it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as tourists began their daily pilgrimage to witness one of Britain's most enduring traditions. Among the sea of eager faces, camera phones, and guidebooks stood the imposing figure of Guard Bennett Thompson, 6 feet of disciplined precision, wrapped in the iconic red tunic and towering bearskin hat that had become synonymous with British pageantry. Bennett had been standing at his post since dawn, his back straight as a rod, his eyes fixed on an invisible point in the distance. This was his 3rd year as a member of the Queen's Guard, and in that time, he had perfected the art of becoming a living statue. The tourists would come and go, children would giggle and point, adults would pose for photographs mere inches from his face, and through it all, Bennett remained unmoved, a testament to centuries of military tradition. But today would be different. Today, the routine would be shattered by a man whose life had spiraled so far out of control that he would make a decision that would haunt him for years to come. Mark Davis had woken up that morning in a dingy bedsit in South London, his head pounding from another night of drowning his sorrows in cheap whiskey. The eviction notice on his door served as a stark reminder of how far he had fallen. 3 months ago, he had been a successful insurance adjuster with a comfortable home in Surrey and a wife who still believed in him. Now, he was unemployed, divorced, and living paycheck to paycheck on whatever odd jobs he could find. The bottle of Jack Daniels on his kitchen counter seemed to mock him as he stumbled toward the bathroom. His reflection in the cracked mirror told the story of a man who had given up on himself. Bloodshot eyes, stubble that hadn't been properly shaved in weeks, and the pallor of someone who spent more time in pubs than in sunlight. By 10 in the morning, Mark had already consumed half the bottle. His original plan had been to meet his solicitor to discuss his mounting debts, but as the amber liquid burned its way down his throat, that appointment seemed less and less important. Instead, he found himself drawn to the idea of visiting central London, perhaps to recapture some memory of better times when he and Sarah would spend weekends exploring the city's historic landmarks. The journey from his flat to Buckingham Palace passed in a haze of underground trains and stumbling steps. Other passengers gave him a wide berth, their noses wrinkling at the smell of alcohol that seemed to emanate from his very pores. Mark was oblivious to their judgment, lost in a fog of self-pity and liquid courage that would soon lead him to make the worst. As Mark approached the palace gates, the grandeur of the building should have filled him with the same awe that millions of visitors experienced each year. Instead, all he could see were symbols of everything he felt had been denied to him: stability, respect, purpose. The tourists around him chatted excitedly in dozens of languages, their joy a stark contrast to the bitterness that had taken root in his heart. Bennett, meanwhile, continued his vigil, unaware that his day was about to take a dramatic turn. He had joined the military straight from school, driven by a desire to serve his country and uphold the traditions that had been passed down through generations of guardsmen. The training had been brutal months of drilling, physical conditioning, and psychological preparation designed to forge ordinary young men into the embodiment of British military excellence. Standing guard at Buckingham Palace was considered an honor, and Bennett took that responsibility seriously. He had memorized every protocol, every procedure, every possible scenario that might arise during his watch. Tourists who got too close, protesters who might cause a disturbance, even the occasional pickpocket who targeted distracted visitors. He had been trained to handle it all with the same stoic professionalism that had become legendary. What he hadn't anticipated was Mark Davis. Mark stood at the edge of the crowd, swaying slightly as he watched Bennett's motionless form. In his alcohol-addled mind, the guard's unwavering stance began to represent everything he despised about his current situation. Here was a man who commanded respect simply by standing still, while Mark couldn't even command the respect of his own wife. The resentment that had been building for months began to crystallize into something more dangerous, a focused anger that demanded release. The other tourists sensed something was wrong. A mother pulled her children closer as Mark muttered incoherently. Under his breath, a security guard stationed near the gift shop began moving in Mark's direction, but the crowd was thick and his progress was slow. Bennett, bound by protocol to maintain his position and focus, remained unaware of the storm that was building just yards away from his post. As the minutes ticked by, Mark's muttering grew louder, his gestures more erratic. The alcohol had stripped away the social inhibitions that normally kept his darker impulses in check, leaving behind a man who felt he had nothing left to lose. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of military discipline and change both men's lives forever. The first sign of trouble came when Mark stepped out of the crowd and began walking directly toward Bennett's position. His gait was unsteady, but his purpose was clear. He was no longer content to observe from a distance. The tourists who had been taking selfies near the guard began to sense the shift in atmosphere, their laughter dying away as they noticed the disheveled man approaching with obvious intent. Bennett's training kicked in immediately. Though he couldn't move his head to track Mark's approach directly, his peripheral vision caught the movement, and years of experience told him that this wasn't a typical tourist interaction. His muscles tensed almost imperceptibly, his body preparing for whatever might come next, while maintaining the outward appearance of complete calm. Mark stopped just 3 feet from Bennett, close enough that the guard could smell the alcohol on his breath. For a long moment, the two men existed in a bubble of tension while the world continued to move around them. Children pointed and whispered. Adults raised their phones to record what they assumed would be another amusing tourist meets guard encounter, and security personnel began to take notice of the developing situation. "Look at you," Mark slurred, his voice barely above a whisper, but laden with venom. "Standing there like some kind of statue. You think you're better than everyone else, don't you?" Bennett's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, but every fiber of his being was now focused on the threat standing before him. His training had covered this scenario countless times: what to do when confronted by an intoxicated or aggressive individual. The key was to remain calm, assess the level of threat, and respond with measured force only if absolutely necessary. Mark took another step closer, his face now inches from Bennett's. The crowd around them had gone completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something far more serious than a typical tourist spectacle. Even the most naive observers could feel the electricity in the air, the sense that something was about to happen that would cross a line from which there would be no return. "I'm talking to you," Mark continued, his voice rising. "What? You too good to answer me? You think that uniform makes you special?" The words hit Bennett like physical blows, not because they hurt his feelings, but because they represented everything he had been trained to endure without response. The guard's code was clear: maintain composure, protect the crown's dignity, and never, under any circumstances, break character while on duty. But as Mark's voice grew louder and more aggressive, Bennett found himself facing a test that no amount of training could fully prepare him for. What happened next would be debated in military circles for years to come. Mark, emboldened by Bennett's silence and driven by a rage that had been building for months, reached out and grabbed the guard's shoulder with enough force to actually move the soldier's body. The contact was electric, not just the physical sensation, but the symbolic weight of what had just occurred. In that instant, several things happened simultaneously. Bennett's training overrode every other consideration in his mind. The rules of engagement were clear. Any physical contact with a guard on duty constituted an assault, and was to be met with immediate and proportionate response. But this wasn't just about following protocol, this was about protecting the integrity of an institution that had stood for centuries. The crowd gasped as Bennett's hand moved with lightning speed, grasping Mark's wrist in a grip that was both precise and punishing. Years of military conditioning had given the guard strength that Mark, weakened by months of poor living and excessive drinking, couldn't hope to match. The alcohol that had given Mark the courage to act now betrayed him, slowing his reflexes and clouding his judgment just when he needed them most. "Sir, you need to step back immediately," Bennett said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. These were the first words he had spoken in hours, and they cut through the morning air like a blade. But Mark was past the point of rational thought. The humiliation of being restrained by the very person he had sought to humiliate only intensified his rage. He struggled against Bennett's grip, his free hand flailing wildly as he tried to strike the guard. The crowd began to back away, Sensing that they were no longer witnessing a simple tourist incident, but something far more dangerous, Bennett's response was a masterclass in controlled force. Instead of escalating the violence, he used Mark's own momentum against him, applying pressure to specific points on the man's arm that caused intense pain without permanent damage. It was a technique perfected through years of training, designed to subdue without seriously injuring. Mark found himself forced to his knees, his shoulders screaming in agony as Bennett maintained his grip. The physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological shock of realizing what he had done. The alcohol haze that had clouded his judgment began to clear, replaced by a cold understanding of the gravity of his actions. The aftermath of the confrontation unfolded with the precision of a well-rehearsed military operation. Within seconds of Mark being forced to his knees, Bennett had activated a discreet alarm system that immediately alerted palace security to the situation. The response was swift, and overwhelming armed police officers materialized from seemingly nowhere, their presence transforming the tourist-friendly atmosphere into something far more serious. Mark found himself surrounded by men and women whose expressions made it clear that his situation had moved far beyond a simple public disturbance. These were counter-terrorism specialists, palace protection officers, and military police professionals who dealt with threats to the royal family and national security on a daily basis. To them, Mark wasn't just a drunk causing trouble. He was a potential threat that needed to be neutralized and investigated. The crowd of tourists, many of whom had been recording the incident on their phones, suddenly found themselves being questioned by police officers who appeared more interested in confiscating evidence than in treating them as witnesses to an amusing spectacle. What had started as entertainment for social media was rapidly becoming something that would have serious legal and security implications. Bennett, meanwhile, had released his grip on Mark and stepped back to his post, his face once again assuming the mask of stoic professionalism that had been momentarily dropped. But those who looked closely could see the slight tension in his jaw, the barely perceptible acceleration of his breathing that indicated just how much the incident had affected him. As Mark was handcuffed and led away, the full weight of his actions began to sink in. The charges would be serious assault on a member of the armed forces, disturbing the peace, public intoxication, and potentially terrorism-related offenses, depending on how the investigation unfolded. His life, which had already reached what he thought was rock bottom, was about to get significantly worse. The tourists who remained began to disperse, their holiday mood thoroughly dampened by what they had witnessed. Many would later describe the incident in terms that made it sound far more dramatic than it actually was, with social media posts claiming they had witnessed everything from a terrorist attack to an assassination attempt. The truth, as is often the case, was both simpler and more complex than the stories that would eventually spread. In the hours that followed Mark's arrest, the incident began to take on a life of its own. The video footage captured by tourists started appearing on social media platforms, each post garnering thousands of views and hundreds of comments from people who felt qualified to judge both Mark's actions and Bennett's response, despite not having been present. The narrative that emerged from these posts was far from accurate. Some portrayed Mark as a victim of excessive force, claiming that Bennett had overreacted to what was essentially harmless drunken behavior. Others painted the guard as a hero who had single-handedly prevented what could have been a much more serious security breach. The truth, as Bennett knew from his training, was that neither extreme was particularly close to reality. Bennett himself was required to file a detailed incident report, a process that took several hours and involved multiple interviews with superior officers, palace security personnel, and internal investigators. Every aspect of his response was scrutinized, from the initial moment of contact to his decision to use physical restraint. The military took such incidents seriously, not just because of their potential legal implications, but because the conduct of the Queen's Guard reflected on the entire institution. Meanwhile, Mark sat in a holding cell in a central London police station, the alcohol finally having worn off enough for him to fully comprehend the magnitude of his mistake. The duty solicitor who had been assigned to his case painted a grim picture. Assault charges were almost certain, and given the high-profile nature of the incident and the current security climate, the Crown Prosecution Service was likely to seek the maximum possible sentence. The irony wasn't lost on Mark that his attempt to strike out at a symbol of everything he felt was wrong with his life had only succeeded in making his situation exponentially worse. What had started as a moment of drunken rage would likely result in a criminal record that would make finding employment even more difficult, potentially leading to imprisonment that would cost him what little he had left. As news of the incident began to filter through official channels, both men found themselves at the center of a media storm that neither had anticipated or wanted. The palace press office issued a brief statement confirming that an incident had occurred and that the individual involved had been arrested, but declined to provide further details. This official silence only served to fuel more speculation and rumor. The legal proceedings that followed would drag on for months, but the immediate consequences for both men were swift and severe. Mark found himself remanded in custody pending trial, his bail application denied due to concerns about public safety and the risk of him reoffending. The magistrate who made this decision noted that assault on a member of the armed forces during the packed execution of their duties was a matter of national security, not just personal violence. Bennett, despite having acted entirely within his authority and training, found himself the subject of an internal investigation that examined every aspect of his conduct. This was standard procedure for any incident involving physical force, but it was nonetheless a stressful experience for a young soldier who had simply been doing his job. The investigation would eventually clear him of any wrongdoing, but the process took weeks and cast a shadow over what should have been a routine posting. The media attention surrounding the case was relentless. Tabloid newspapers ran sensationalized headlines about tourist attacks, Queen's Guard, while more serious publications used the incident as a springboard for discussions about security at royal palaces, the training of ceremonial guards, and the broader issues of public order in tourist areas. Mark's background was thoroughly investigated and publicly dissected. Journalists discovered his recent divorce, his unemployment, his financial difficulties, and his history of alcohol abuse. What emerged was a portrait of a man whose life had fallen apart. But this context did little to generate sympathy for his actions. If anything, it reinforced the narrative that he was someone who had lost control and represented exactly the kind of threat that security measures were designed to prevent. Bennett, by contrast, was portrayed as the epitome of professional military conduct. His service record was exemplary, his training impeccable, and his response to the incident was held up as a textbook example of how such situations should be handled. But this praise came at a personal cost. The young soldier found himself uncomfortable with the attention and eager to return to the anonymity that had characterized his service up to that point. The incident also sparked broader discussions about the role of ceremonial guards in modern security arrangements. Some argued that the traditional posting of guards at public locations made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of attack that Mark had attempted, while others maintained that the visible presence of military personnel was an important deterrent to more serious threats. As the weeks passed, the full scope of the incident's impact became clear. Mark's trial date was set for 3 months later, giving his legal team time to prepare a defense strategy that would likely focus on his mental state at the time of the offense and his history of personal difficulties. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Multiple video recordings, dozens of witnesses, and his own admission of guilt made during his initial police interview. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Mark had committed a serious assault on a member of the armed forces while they were performing their duties. The location of the offense outside Buckingham Palace added an additional layer of severity, as did the potential security implications of allowing such behavior to go unpunished. The Crown Prosecution Service made it clear that they intended to seek a custodial sentence that would send a strong message about the consequences of such actions. Bennett, meanwhile, had returned to his regular duties, but the incident had changed him in ways that weren't immediately apparent. The split-second decision to use physical force had been correct, according to all protocols and training, but it had also been his first real-world application of techniques that had previously existed only in theoretical scenarios. The experience had given him a deeper understanding of the weight of responsibility that came with his position. The internal investigation concluded that Bennett's actions had been entirely appropriate, and that no disciplinary action was warranted. His superiors commended his restraint and professionalism, noting that a less experienced or less well-trained individual might have escalated the situation unnecessarily. The report became part of his service record and would likely be cited in future training scenarios as an example of proper procedure. But beyond the official vindication, Bennett struggled with the personal impact of what had occurred. He had joined the military to serve his country and uphold traditions that he respected, not to become involved in violent confrontations with disturbed civilians. The incident had forced him to confront the reality that his ceremonial role also carried genuine security responsibilities that could require him to use force against his fellow citizens. The tourism industry around Buckingham Palace was also affected by the incident. Visitor numbers dropped temporarily as potential tourists worried about security and safety, while those who did visit often asked pointed questions about what they had seen or heard regarding the confrontation. Tour guides found themselves having to address the incident and reassure visitors that such events were extremely rare. The trial, when it finally took place, was a somber affair that attracted significant media attention. Mark appeared in the dock wearing a suit that his solicitor had provided, looking significantly different from the disheveled man who had confronted Bennett months earlier. The intervening time in custody had forced him to confront his alcohol addiction, and he appeared healthier physically, though the psychological toll of his situation was evident in his demeanor. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Video evidence was presented showing Mark's approach to Bennett, his increasingly aggressive behavior, and the moment when he made physical contact with the guard. Witness testimony from tourists and security personnel painted a picture of a man who had been clearly intoxicated and increasingly agitated. Before the confrontation occurred, Bennett was called to testify, and his account of the incident was delivered with the same professional precision that had characterized his response on the day in question. He described feeling threatened by Mark's behavior, explained the protocols he had followed in responding to the physical contact, and detailed the training that had prepared him for such situations. His testimony was measured and factual, avoiding any hint of emotion or personal opinion about Mark's actions or motivations. The defense attempted to present Mark's personal circumstances as mitigating factors, arguing that his recent divorce, unemployment, and alcohol abuse had created a perfect storm of psychological distress that had led to the incident. Character witnesses testified about Mark's previous good behavior and his genuine remorse for what had occurred. A psychiatrist provided expert testimony about the effects of alcohol on judgment and impulse control. However, the judge made it clear that while personal circumstances might be considered during sentencing, they could not excuse assault on a member of the armed forces. The security implications of the offense, combined with its high-profile nature and potential to encourage copycat incidents, meant that a significant sentence was warranted regardless of Mark's personal difficulties. The verdict was never in doubt. Mark was found guilty on all charges, and the judge's sentencing remarks emphasized the seriousness of his actions and their potential consequences. The 18-month prison sentence that followed was severe but not unexpected, accompanied by a restraining order preventing Mark from approaching any royal residence or ceremonial guard post. In the months that followed the trial, both men attempted to rebuild their lives in the shadow of an incident that had changed them both permanently. Mark served his sentence in a medium-security prison, where he participated in alcohol addiction programs and vocational training designed to help him reintegrate into society upon his release. The process was difficult and often dispiriting, but it also provided him with the first real structure his life had had in years. Prison gave Mark time to reflect on the choices that had led him to that courtroom, and gradually he began to understand that his assault on Bennett had been the culmination of a series of destructive decisions rather than a single moment of madness. The alcohol had been a symptom of deeper problems: depression, feelings of inadequacy, and an inability to cope with the setbacks that life had thrown at him. Bennett continued his service with the Queen's Guard, but the incident had marked a turning point in his military career. He was eventually promoted to corporal, partly in recognition of his professional handling of the confrontation, and he began to take on training responsibilities for new recruits. His experience became part of the curriculum used to prepare other guards for similar situations. The broader impact of the incident extended far beyond the two individuals directly involved. Security protocols at royal palaces were reviewed and strengthened, with additional measures put in place to identify and intercept potential threats before they could approach ceremonial guards. The training provided to guards was also updated to incorporate lessons learned from Bennett's experience. for the tourism industry. The incident served as a reminder of the complex security challenges involved in maintaining public access to historic sites while protecting both visitors and personnel. New guidelines were developed for tours operators and guides, emphasizing the importance of respecting boundaries and understanding the serious nature of the guard's duties. The story of Mark Davis and Bennett Thompson became a case study used in military academies, police training programs, and security courses around the world. It illustrated the importance of proper training, appropriate response to threats, and the complex human factors that can turn routine situations into serious incidents. As time passed, the intense media attention faded, but the lessons learned from that morning outside Buckingham Palace continued to influence policy and practice. For Mark, serving his sentence and eventually rebuilding his life became a long journey toward redemption and self-understanding. For Bennett, the incident became a defining moment that shaped his approach to duty and service for the rest of his military career. The confrontation that lasted only minutes had consequences that would ripple through both men's lives for years to come, serving as a stark reminder that single moments of poor judgment can have profound and lasting impacts on everyone involved.